The proposal. In the quiet corners of her Lisbon apartment, under the dim light of her worn-out lamp, Lee Martins sat, lost in the clatter of her typewriter. For years, this small haven had been a sanctuary for her thoughts, ambitions, and dreams. The faded posters of famous authors on her walls reminded her of the legacy she sought to create. But tonight, the sound of each keystroke felt hollow, echoing and gnawing unease. She could barely focus, her thoughts clouded by a dark reality that had crept into her life, threatening to pull her away from her dreams. Her father's gambling debts had left her family in a vulnerable state, bound to creditors who had little sympathy for the Martins' financial collapse. Lee's father had been a man of grand visions and elaborate schemes, but a string of failed investments had drained the family's savings. The bills stacked high on the kitchen table, growing heavier each day, felt like a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Lee's mother, Elena, had always been a quiet yet strong presence in her life. With gentle patience, she guided Lee through life's challenges, instilling in her a love for literature and an unyielding resilience. But as Elena packed away Lee's manuscripts, carefully folding her daughter's life into 2 suitcases, her eyes brimmed with a sorrow she could not hide. She knew the depth of the sacrifice being made, and every silent tear was a testament to the pain of watching her daughter's independence slip away. It was on one of these melancholic nights, as Lee contemplated her family's future, that a stranger appeared at their door. He was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, radiating an air of authority. Lee's mother had let him in, and with a firm voice, he introduced himself as a representative of the Yilmaz family, a name that held weight in business circles across Europe and the Middle East. The Yilmaz family was known for its wealth, built on an empire of oil and real estate that stretched from the deserts of Saudi Arabia to the bustling streets of Istanbul. Hussein Yilmaz, the patriarch, had crafted a life of luxury and power, carefully positioning his family as one of the most influential in Turkey. But to Lee, the name was a distant echo, a world far removed from her modest existence in Lisbon. "Your family's debts are substantial, Miss Martins," the man had begun, his voice devoid of warmth. "Mr. Hussein Yilmaz has offered a solution." Lee's heart pounded, a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. She knew what he was going to say before he even spoke. "Marriage," he continued, eyes unwavering, "to Hussein Yilmaz's only son, Karim." A stunned silence filled the room. Her mind raced, the weight of the words crashing over her like waves. Marriage. To a stranger. It felt archaic, like a twisted fairy tale where she was the sacrificial lamb. Lee had always valued her independence, fought for it fiercely, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, it was slipping through her fingers. Karim Yilmaz was an enigma, a man who lived in the shadow of his father's empire. In Istanbul, he was celebrated, a public figure groomed from birth to inherit the vast Yilmaz legacy. But beneath the polished exterior, he carried the burdens of a life scripted by others. Every choice, every action, was calculated by his father, a man who viewed emotions as weaknesses and family as assets to be used strategically. As Lee packed the last of her belongings, she felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She was leaving behind the cobblestone streets of Lisbon, the smell of the sea breeze, and her modest dreams, trading them for an opulent yet oppressive world. The Yilmaz estate, she'd been told, was nothing short of a fortress, a grand symbol of wealth and power. But to Lee, it sounded like a gilded cage. On her journey to Istanbul, Lee struggled to contain the swirl of emotions within her. Anxiety, anger, and a flicker of hope danced together in her mind. She tried to imagine the life that awaited her, the man she would meet, and the family she was being thrust into. Yet, with every mile, the vastness of the unknown only deepened. As her plane touched down in Istanbul, the city unfolded beneath her like a vast tapestry, with its towering skyscrapers casting shadows over ancient streets and bazaars. The contrast was jarring, a blend of modernity and history that seemed to reflect her own conflicting emotions. She was swept through customs by a driver who spoke little but was unfailingly polite, his presence a constant reminder of the opulent world she was entering. The Yilmaz estate loomed in the distance, a sprawling mansion surrounded by meticulously groomed gardens. The architecture was grand, every detail exuding wealth and refinement. But for all its beauty, it felt cold, impersonal, a far cry from her humble home in Lisbon. She was ushered through the grand halls by servants, their footsteps echoing in the vast silence, each step a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. When she was finally shown to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror. Her face looked pale, her eyes wide with apprehension. She was not the same person who had dreamed of being a writer in the comfort of her apartment. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, bound by the choices of others. The next day, Lee met Karim for the first time. The encounter was formal, almost clinical, as though they were two diplomats from different countries meeting to discuss a treaty. Karim was tall, with dark eyes that held a quiet intensity, a look that seemed to pierce through her defenses. His expression was guarded, his words polite but devoid of warmth. Yet beneath the surface, she sensed a depth, a hidden layer that defied his polished exterior. As they spoke, Lee glimpsed flashes of vulnerability in Karim. He was not the cold, calculating heir she had expected. There was a quiet sadness in his voice, a bitterness that hinted at his own reluctance to be part of this arrangement. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and in that silent exchange, they recognized something familiar in each other, a shared sense of confinement, a mutual longing for freedom. Their conversation was brief, filled with pleasantries and practiced smiles. Yet, despite the formalities, an unspoken understanding began to form between them, a fragile connection that defied the circumstances of their meeting. In the days that followed, they were swept into the preparations for their wedding, a grand affair that would cement the bond between their families. For Karim, every fitting and ceremony was a reminder of his submission to family duty, the weight of expectations pressing down on him. For Lee, each celebration felt like a step further away from her past, a reluctant surrender to a future she had not chosen. Their shared discomfort drew them closer, a bond forged in silence and mutual sacrifice. As the wedding day approached, the walls of the Yilmaz estate seemed to close in on them, the grand halls whispering secrets and shadows. Lee found herself haunted by a sense of foreboding, a feeling that this union was merely the beginning of something darker, something hidden beneath the polished surface of the Yilmaz family's wealth and power. She could not have known that, within the walls of the estate, lay secrets that would change her life forever. Nor could she have imagined the twists and turns that awaited her, the tangled web of betrayal and passion that would soon entangle both her and Karim. For now, they were strangers bound by duty, navigating the turbulent waters of an arranged marriage, each clinging to the remnants of their old lives. But beneath the layers of formality, a spark had been lit, a spark that would challenge the foundations of their world and threaten to unravel the very fabric of their lives. And as Lee stood at the edge of her new reality, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey had only just begun. Secrets unveiled. The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of responsibilities and silent observation. Lee found herself swept into the complex rhythms of the Yilmaz household, a place where wealth dictated everything from the ornate chandeliers in the hallways to the delicate porcelain cups served with morning tea. The estate was alive with activity, but it was an energy that felt contrived, as though every action was choreographed, each person a performer in a well-rehearsed play. Lee had never felt so alone. Her interactions with Karim were polite, even friendly at times, but there was an invisible wall between them. They lived under the same roof, attended the same gatherings, and shared quiet dinners in the grand dining hall. But despite this proximity, they were strangers bound by a contract neither of them had chosen. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Lee wandered the vast halls of the estate. She was drawn to the library, a grand room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with volumes that seemed untouched by time. It was one of the few places in the mansion that felt alive, filled with stories and whispers of the past. The scent of aged leather and parchment wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, a stark contrast to the cold marble halls outside. Lee ran her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling the weight of centuries beneath her fingertips. She was about to turn away when something peculiar caught her eye. A small panel on the wall, slightly ajar, hidden behind a row of volumes. Her curiosity piqued. She carefully pressed on it, and to her surprise, the panel slid open, revealing the hidden drawer. Inside, she found a collection of letters, bound by a faded ribbon and yellowed with age. They were written in a delicate, looping script, and as she unfolded the first letter, Lee's eyes widened in disbelief. The letters were addressed to none other than Hussein Yilmaz, Karim's father, but what shocked her most was the name signed at the bottom of each letter, Isabella. The letters were passionate, filled with words of love and longing that seemed to leap off the page. Each sentence was infused with an emotional fervor that hinted at a deep, forbidden romance. Lee's heart pounded as she realized the implications. This was more than just a fleeting affair. These letters spoke of a love that had endured through secrecy and sacrifice. Isabella described stolen moments and whispered promises, painting a portrait of a man who was far different from the stoic, calculating Hussein she knew. But as she continued reading, a chill ran down her spine. Isabella's descriptions, her heartfelt words, matched memories Lee had heard her own mother, Alina, speak of in hushed tones long ago. Could it be that her mother had been the mysterious Isabella? Lee's mind spun with questions. If her mother had indeed loved Hussein, what did that mean for her own marriage to Karim? Was this union simply another link in a chain of manipulation spanning generations? The thought left her feeling trapped, as though her life had been a part of a carefully constructed web, spun by hands long since buried in the past. She returned to her room, the letters clutched tightly in her hands. That night, sleep eluded her as she grappled with the unsettling possibility that her life had been orchestrated long before she was even born. Meanwhile, on the other side of the estate, Karim was waging his own internal battle. His father had recently begun involving him more deeply in the family's business, thrusting him into high-stakes meetings and strategic discussions that left Karim uneasy. He'd always been aware that his family operated in the morally gray areas of the business world, but the depth of his father's dealings was far more sinister than he'd ever imagined. In one particular meeting, Karim was handed a contract to review, an agreement that granted the Yilmaz family ownership of a valuable piece of land in exchange for what seemed like an obscenely small payment. When he questioned the fairness of the deal, his father had simply waved a dismissive hand. "It's business, Karim. Fairness is a luxury we can't afford," Hussein had said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "You're not here to be liked. You're here to secure our future." Karim's discomfort grew with each revelation, his moral compass clashing with the realities of his family's empire. The contracts were filled with legal loopholes, exploiting people and communities with little recourse. It was a world he had been groomed for, yet every fiber of his being rebelled against it. He began to see his father not as a successful businessman, but as a puppet master, pulling strings in a game where people were mere pawns. Lee, too, was becoming more aware of the forces at play within the Yilmaz family. She'd overheard hushed conversations, fragments of words that hinted at alliances and rivalries. One name, in particular, seemed to come up frequently: Ozan, a prominent businessman who had once been close to Hussein. The relationship had soured over the years, turning Ozan into a powerful adversary who now challenged the Yilmaz family's dominance in Istanbul. As Lee and Karim navigated their new lives, their paths converged over a quiet dinner one evening. The vast dining hall, with its opulent chandeliers and gilded mirrors, felt almost absurdly extravagant to Lee, a reminder of the life she had been thrust into. She glanced across the table, watching Karim as he sipped his wine, his gaze distant and brooding. Taking a deep breath, she decided to break the silence. "Karim, have you ever felt Trapped. The words slipped out before she could stop them, a vulnerability she hadn't meant to reveal. Karim looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he spoke. "More than you know," he replied quietly. There was a sadness in his voice, a depth of emotion that mirrored her own. Emboldened, Lee continued, "I found something. Something that makes me question why we're really here." She hesitated, unsure if she could trust him with the letters. But as she saw the conflict in his eyes, she decided to take a chance. Slowly, she pulled the letters from her bag and placed them on the table between them. "These were hidden in the library," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were written to your father by a woman named Isabella." Karim's expression shifted as he scanned the letters, his eyes narrowing as he took in the words. This is impossible," he muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. "My father never spoke of her. I assumed he was cold, distant. But this?" He looked up at her, a mixture of confusion and revelation in his gaze. "Why did you show me this?" Lee held his gaze, the weight of her own secrets pressing down on her. "Because I think there's more to this than we understand. I think our families have been connected for a long time, far longer than we knew. And I think that maybe we're not just here because of a debt or a business deal." In that moment, something shifted between them. The walls they had built around themselves, the protective layers of distance and formality, began to crack. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two people caught in a web of secrets, trying to unravel a history that bound their families in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their mutual understanding grew, forming the first fragile threads of trust. Over the following weeks, they spent more time together, sharing glimpses of their pasts, their dreams, and their regrets. Karim revealed his frustration with his father's business practices, his desire to create something more meaningful and ethical. Lee shared her love of writing, her longing to return to the simplicity of her life in Lisbon. But beneath their growing connection, an undercurrent of tension remained. They were still bound by their families' legacies, by choices made long before they were born. And as they delved deeper into the history of their families, they began to uncover truths that were darker and more complex than they could have imagined. Late one night, after another fruitless attempt to understand the connections between their parents, Karim looked at Lee with a resolve she hadn't seen before. "We need to confront them," he said firmly. "We need answers." Lee nodded, feeling the surge of determination. Together, they would face the secrets of their past, and perhaps, in doing so, they might find a way to break free from the chains of their family's expectations. The confrontation would be difficult, and it would risk unraveling everything they had known. But they were no longer just pawns in a game. They were partners, bound not by duty, but by a shared desire to uncover the truth and to forge their own path amidst the shadows of manipulation and power that surrounded them. The confrontation. The morning air in Istanbul was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of the Bosphorus and a lingering chill that clung to the walls of the Yilmaz mansion. In the early light, the estate seemed even more formidable, the grand architecture casting long shadows that seemed to guard the secrets hidden within its walls. Lee stood at her bedroom window, gazing at the sprawling gardens below, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Today, she and Karim had decided, would be the day they confronted their parents, the day they sought answers to the mysteries that bound their families in ways neither had foreseen. Over the past few weeks, she and Karim had grown closer, each finding solace in the other's shared burden. They'd spent late nights in whispered conversations, piecing together fragments of the past like detectives uncovering clues in a labyrinthine puzzle. The letters she'd found, filled with Isabella's poetic declarations of love for Hussein, had been the catalyst. But as they uncovered more, Lee realized that her mother, Elena, held the key to understanding the nature of this hidden history. Karim was waiting for her in the hallway, his face set in a mask of determination. He looked every bit the heir to an empire, but Lee could see the vulnerability beneath the surface, a hesitation that mirrored her own. He reached out, taking her hand briefly, a silent gesture of solidarity. They began with Elena, deciding that Lee's mother might be more willing to share the truth away from Hussein's influence. They found her in one of the quieter drawing rooms, surrounded by ornate furniture and heavy drapes that cast a soft, amber glow in the morning sun. Elena looked up as they entered, her face a mixture of surprise and concern as she took in their expressions. "Lee, Karim, is something wrong?" Elena asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. Lee took a steadying breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Mother, I found something." Letters hidden in the library. They were written to Hussein by someone named Isabella. A silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. Elena's face paled, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. She glanced away, avoiding their eyes as she absorbed the weight of Lee's revelation. "Isabella," she murmured, almost to herself. I never expected those letters to be found." Lee's heart hammered in her chest. "Mother, please, I need to understand. Who was she? And what does this mean for our families? Did you love Hussein?" Elena's shoulders slumped, her guarded expression giving way to one of profound sadness. She looked up, her gaze meeting Lee's with a vulnerability Lee had rarely seen. For a moment, she was not just Lee's mother, but a woman who had lived through her own tragedy, a woman who had loved and lost. "Yes, I loved him," Elena confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I loved Hussein deeply, once. But our love was never meant to survive. I was Isabella, Lee. The woman in those letters, that was me." The admission sent a shockwave through Lee, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She struggled to process this revelation, to reconcile the mother she knew with the passionate, poetic Isabella described in the letters. "It was a different time, Lee," Elena continued, her gaze distant. "We were young, and I was naive. I thought love was enough to bridge the chasm between us. But Hussein's family had ambitions, plans that left no room for the daughter of a modest Portuguese family. When it became clear that he would marry someone of his family's choosing, I left Istanbul and returned to Lisbon, heartbroken and determined to leave that part of my life behind." Karim listened in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with a mix of emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with restrained anger. "So that's it. You left, but years later, here we are, bound by this marriage because of debts engineered by my father. It wasn't enough for him to break your heart. He had to control my life as well." Elena nodded, a trace of bitterness in her expression. "Hussein has always been strategic. When I heard of your marriage to Lee, I feared he had orchestrated it as a means to tie our families together on his terms. He's a man who never truly lets go of the past." Lee's mind raced, 1,000 questions vying for attention. But before she could ask more, the door opened, and Hussein entered. He paused, his gaze moving from Lee to Karim, and finally to Elena, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" Hussein's voice was cold, authoritative, yet tinged with a hint of curiosity. It was the voice of a man used to commanding a room, to bending people to his will. Karim straightened, his tone defiant. "Father, we know about the letters. We know about the history between you and Elena. What we don't understand is why you would go to such lengths to bring our families together, years after she left you." Hussein's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, flashed in his eyes. He moved further into the room, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on Karim. "It's true that Elena and I had a history," he began, his voice measured. "But history is nothing without legacy. My marriage, my business decisions, even your marriage, Karim, these are not matters of the heart. They are matters of necessity, of survival. Love is fleeting. Power endures." Lee felt a surge of anger at his callous words. "But why us?" she demanded. "Why involve me in this game? If you wanted Elena, why didn't you fight for her?" Hussein's eyes shifted to Lee, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him. a weakness that seemed out of place on his stoic face. "I did fight," he said quietly, "but I was a younger man then, one who thought he could have both love and power. When I realized that wasn't possible, I chose the path that would secure my family's future. And when I saw the opportunity to bring our families together once more, I took it." Kareem's voice was sharp, filled with a bitterness Lee had never heard before. "So you ruined her life, and now you've bound us in the same prison of duty and expectation. Is that it? This isn't a legacy, Father. It's a curse." The tension in the room was palpable, each word a dagger cutting through the silence. Lee felt the weight of their shared history bearing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to shake her mother and Hussein, to make them see the damage their choices had wrought on the next generation. Alina, sensing the brewing storm, spoke softly. "Lee, Kareem, I'm sorry. I truly am. If I had known the cost of my decisions, I would have made different choices. But the past cannot be changed. All we can do is decide how we will face the future." Hussein's gaze softened slightly, though his pride kept him from admitting any fault. "You have the power to make something of this union, Kareem. To steer it in a direction that will benefit both families. That is your responsibility now." Lee couldn't take it any longer. She rose from her seat, her hands clenched in fists, her voice filled with a mix of pain and defiance. "You speak of power and legacy as though they are the only things that matter. But you've forgotten something important. People matter. Their dreams, their desires, they matter too." Hussein's face hardened, but Lee held her ground, unflinching. She was done being a pawn in his twisted game. She glanced at Kareem, seeing in his eyes a shared determination. They had both been thrust into this life, but they would not let it define them. After a long, tense silence, Hussein finally spoke, his tone resigned but unyielding. "You are free to make your own choices, but remember, freedom has a price. This world will not bend to the whims of idealism. In the end, only those with power survive." With that, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. Lee looked at her mother, who offered a sad smile, an unspoken apology in her eyes. She had her own regrets, her own burdens, but nothing could change the past. As Kareem and Lee stood together in the quiet aftermath, a sense of clarity settled over them. They were no longer bound by their parents' choices or the mistakes of the past. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, the illusion of the life they'd been thrust into had shattered. "We decide what happens next," Kareem said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "Not them. Not anyone else." Lee nodded, feeling the strength she hadn't known before. They were not bound by duty, nor by history. Together, they would carve their own path, even if it meant defying everything their family stood for. They would find their own way forward, toward a future built on their terms, no longer prisoners of the past. With that shared resolve, they walked away from the drawing room, leaving behind the echoes of their family's secrets, ready to face whatever lay ahead, united in purpose and perhaps something more, a fragile alliance. The days after the confrontation were filled with an uneasy calm that settled like dust over the Yilmaz estate. Though the truth had been unveiled, it left Lee and Kareem in a state of restless uncertainty. Their confrontation with Hussein and Alina had shifted something fundamental in their lives, leaving them with more questions than answers. The burden of their family's past had left a scar that wouldn't easily heal, yet it also gave them a sense of freedom they hadn't anticipated. In the quiet moments they managed to steal together, away from the ever-watchful eyes of the household, they began to form a new kind of alliance, one built not on familial obligations, but on mutual trust and understanding. It was tentative and raw, like a wound slowly healing, but it was theirs. They both understood that they needed to work together if they wanted to change the direction of their lives. One evening, as they strolled through the mansion's vast gardens, the quiet hum of cicadas filling the air, Kareem turned to Lee, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice laced with a mix of hesitation and determination. About the family business, about everything my father has built. I can't continue down this path, not like this, at least. I want to change things, Lee. I want to transform our business into something sustainable, something that doesn't exploit people or land. Lee listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of admiration and relief. Here was a man burdened with immense responsibility, yet he held a quiet resolve to reshape his inheritance, to turn it into something good. It was a stark contrast to the cold ambition of his father, Hussein, who saw people and resources only as tools for his own gain. She respected Karim's courage. His willingness to face the family's legacy rather than accept it blindly was a quality she found herself increasingly drawn to. "I think that's a beautiful vision, Karim," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "But you know your father will fight you every step of the way. He spent a lifetime building this empire on his own terms. He's not going to let you dismantle it without a fight." Karim nodded, a look of steely resolve settling over his features. "I'm prepared for that. I've spent my life living in the shadow of his expectations, following a path he set for me. But that ends now. I want to prove to him, and to myself, that there's a different way forward." Lee placed a reassuring hand on his arm, the simple gesture brimming with unspoken support. She, too, was discovering her own strength, realizing that perhaps she could be more than a reluctant bride in a gilded cage. Together, they could become something more, not only breaking free from the chains of the past, but also reshaping the future. For the first time since arriving in Istanbul, Lee felt a spark of hope. Their tentative alliance was soon put to the test. Rumors had started to circulate among Istanbul's elite circles, whispers of Karim's intent to shift the family business in a new direction. While some dismissed it as idle gossip, others took a keen interest, particularly those who stood to lose from the Yilmaz family's changing stance. These were powerful men, entrenched in the business and political spheres of Istanbul, individuals who valued tradition and profit over innovation and ethics. One afternoon, as Karim prepared for a high-stakes business meeting, Lee found him in his office, his suit jacket draped over a chair, his sleeves rolled up as he pored over a series of reports and documents. She watched him from the doorway for a moment, admiring the intensity in his gaze, the way he seemed to channel all his frustrations into a fierce concentration. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, stepping into the room. Karim glanced up, a faint smile crossing his lips. "As ready as I'll ever be. This meeting could be the first step in making real changes, but I know it's going to come with a fight. These men, they won't be pleased." "Then let's make sure they hear you," Lee replied, her tone resolute. "You don't have to face them alone." In that moment, Karim realized he had an ally in Lee. She wasn't just a reluctant participant in his family's schemes. She was becoming an active partner, willing to stand beside him in his fight to reshape his family's legacy. It was a small revelation, but it deepened the connection between them, drawing them closer in a way neither had anticipated. The meeting was held in a private boardroom within one of Istanbul's most exclusive high-rise buildings, the kind of space designed to intimidate and inspire respect. Seated across the table were three of Istanbul's most influential businessmen, men who had built their fortunes alongside the Yilmaz family, sharing in the spoils of lucrative deals and questionable practices. They looked at Karim with expressions of mild curiosity and subtle disdain, as though he were a child pretending to play at being a businessman. Karim didn't flinch. He began to outline his vision for the Yilmaz family business, describing his plans to invest in sustainable energy, to shift away from exploitative practices, and to create a business model that valued people as much as profits. His voice was calm but unwavering, each word carefully chosen, each point backed by data and projections. The men listened in silence, their expressions hardening as Karim spoke. When he finished, the room fell into a tense silence, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Finally, one of the men, an older gentleman with a face lined from years of hardened decisions, leaned forward, a mocking smile on his lips. "Young man," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You may have grand ideals, but ideals don't build empires. Empires are built on strength and pragmatism. Your father understood that. This talk of sustainability and ethics, it's the language of fools who don't understand the nature of power." Karim met his gaze, unflinching. "Perhaps the nature of power is changing, Mr. Demir. And if we don't adapt, we'll find ourselves on the wrong side of history." The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "History favors the ruthless, Karim. Don't forget that." Lee watched, her heart pounding as Karim held his ground. She felt a surge of pride, mixed with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't expected. In that moment, she saw him as more than just her husband by arrangement. He was a man willing to stand up to giants, to challenge a legacy that had cast a shadow over his life for far too long. After the meeting, Karim and Lee left the boardroom together, the tension between them palpable. He was visibly shaken, his expression guarded as he replayed the conversation in his mind. "Are you all right?" Lee asked, reaching out to him as they walked through the polished marble lobby. Karim let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I knew they wouldn't be supportive, but it's one thing to know and another to face it. They'll make things difficult, Lee. They won't let me change things without a fight." "Then let them fight," she replied, her voice fierce. "We'll be ready." They returned to the Yilmaz estate that evening, both exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose. As they walked through the grand hallways, Lee felt a growing sense of solidarity with Karim. Their lives, once separate and filled with resentment, were becoming intertwined in a way that felt natural, even necessary. They were not just fighting against the expectations of their families. They were building something together, something that belonged to them alone. In the following weeks, Karim's resolve strengthened. He began to implement changes within the business, discreetly reshaping policies and forging alliances with forward-thinking investors. Lee supported him, using her natural intuition and intelligence to navigate the complex web of Istanbul's elite society. She attended events and social gatherings, listening, observing, and quietly making connections that would strengthen their position. Their partnership grew stronger with each passing day, and so did the unspoken bond between them. They began sharing more about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. In the quiet hours of the night, they would sit together, discussing everything from their hopes for the future to the scars of their past. What began as a reluctant alliance was blossoming into something deeper, something fragile but undeniably real. One night, as they sat by the large windows overlooking the city lights, Karim turned to her, his gaze intense. "Lee, I know this marriage wasn't what either of us wanted, but I want you to know that I'm grateful you're here. I couldn't do this alone." Lee felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of belonging she hadn't expected. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Neither could I. We're in this together, Karim." In that moment, their fragile alliance transformed into a genuine partnership. They were no longer two strangers bound by duty. They were allies, equals, and perhaps something more. The future remained uncertain, filled with obstacles and threats, but together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to carve their own path amidst the shadows of their families' legacies. And in the quiet darkness, beneath the weight of Istanbul's shimmering skyline, they felt, for the first time, that they had found something worth fighting for. Not just a future of their own making, but a chance at a love that defied the past, a love forged in the fires of adversity and resilience. The storm gathers. Weeks turned into months, and Lee and Karim's fragile alliance solidified into a powerful partnership. Together, they continued to challenge the status quo of the Yilmaz Empire, pushing for sustainable and ethical changes despite the resistance they faced. Their relationship, once defined by reluctant duty, had evolved into a bond of mutual respect and shared ambition. But as they forged ahead, they began to sense the looming presence of forces intent on undermining their progress. One evening, as Karim wrapped up his work in his study, A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Lee entered, her face lit by the faint glow of the hallway light behind her. She was holding a document in her hand, her expression grave. "I think we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her and crossing the room to stand before his desk. Kareem looked up, concern flickering in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, Lee handed him the document. As Kareem scanned the text, his expression darkened. It was a copy of a contract, a deal that had been signed in secret, effectively granting one of Hussein's old business partners control over a portion of their most profitable assets. The terms were clearly designed to drain resources from Kareem's new initiatives, funneling money and influence back into the hands of those who wanted things to stay the same. "This is my father's doing," Kareem muttered, his jaw clenched in frustration. "He's cutting deals behind my back to sabotage the changes we're making." Lee nodded, her voice steady. "It's worse than that, Kareem. I looked into the man who signed this contract, Nader Demir. He's been trying to take control of parts of the Yilmaz Empire for years. And he's not alone. Your father's former allies see your plans as a threat, and they're banding together to push back." Kareem ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of anger and determination. He had known that his father wouldn't simply stand by and watch him dismantle decades of carefully crafted business strategies. But he hadn't expected such calculated sabotage. The forces arrayed against him were stronger than he had anticipated, and he realized that if he wasn't careful, he could lose everything. "They want to scare us, to make us back down," Kareem said, his voice laced with defiance. "But I'm not going to let them win. We've come too far to let them take this away." Lee placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're not alone in this. There are people who support what we're trying to do. Investors, new partners. We need to strengthen those alliances and show these men that their time is over." Kareem looked up at her, a grateful smile softening his features. "You've been my anchor through all of this, Lee. I don't know what I'd do without you." They spent the next few days in a frenzy of planning, meeting with allies, and securing the support they needed to withstand the pressure from Hussein's associates. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, Kareem felt as though he were truly taking control of his own life, defining his legacy rather than inheriting one he didn't believe in. And Lee, with her intelligence and resilience, was at his side every step of the way. However, the opposition's response was swift and ruthless. Kareem received a message from his father, cold and unyielding, ordering him to attend a family meeting at the Yilmaz family's private estate outside of Istanbul. The message was clear. Hussein was not pleased, and he was prepared to confront his son directly. It was a summons that could not be ignored. The estate was a sprawling mansion nestled in the countryside, surrounded by high walls and dense forests. As Kareem and Lee approached, they were met with an eerie silence that seemed to press down on them like a heavy shroud. They entered the grand hall, where Hussein waited, flanked by several of his most loyal advisors and business associates. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an undercurrent of hostility. "Kareem," Hussein began, his tone cold and measured, "I've been hearing troubling things. You seem to be under the impression that you can change the course of our family's legacy without consequence." Kareem met his father's gaze, his expression unwavering. "I'm not changing our legacy, Father. I'm building a future that respects people and the environment. We can't continue to exploit others for our own gain. Times have changed." Hussein's eyes narrowed. "Times may have changed, but principles do not. Power requires sacrifice. Our family's position is not something you can gamble with your naive ideals. You are trying to dismantle what I spent my life building. You're spitting on the sacrifices I made for you, for our family." Lee, standing beside Kareem, felt a surge of anger. "With all due respect, Mr. Yilmaz, sacrifice doesn't justify exploitation. Kareem's vision is about creating something lasting, something that won't destroy people's lives or the environment. It's about building a legacy that isn't tainted by greed." Hussein's gaze shifted to Lee, his expression hardening. "You speak boldly, Mrs. Yilmaz. For someone who was brought into this family solely because of a debt. You're here because of my charity, not because you have any stake in this legacy. Lee felt the sting of his words, but she stood her ground. I may have been brought here because of a debt, but I'm staying by Kareem's side because I believe in him. He has the courage to make a difference. If that's a threat to your legacy, then maybe it's time to question what kind of legacy you're really leaving. Hussein's face darkened, his expression one of barely concealed fury. He turned back to Kareem, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. I am warning you, Kareem. If you continue down this path, you will no longer have my protection. The empire I built will not support your foolish whims. You'll be on your own. Kareem straightened, his voice calm but resolute. Then so be it, Father. I will build a future I can be proud of, even if it means walking away from everything you've built. For a moment, silence filled the room, a heavy pause that seemed to echo through the halls of the estate. Hussein's expression hardened, and he nodded to his advisors, a signal that the conversation was over. Leave, he said, his tone icy. You've made your choice. Don't come crawling back when it all falls apart. Kareem and Lee left the estate, a mixture of relief and dread settling over them. They had broken free from Hussein's influence, but they knew it wouldn't be the end. His threats would not be empty. Hussein Yilmaz was a man who knew how to wield power and influence, and he would not let them go without a fight. In the weeks that followed, the pressure intensified. Rumors began to circulate, fueled by Hussein's allies, about Kareem's reckless new direction for the family business. Long-standing investors were spooked, and deals that had once seemed secure began to fall through. Business partners hesitated, and whispers of Kareem's supposed incompetence spread through the city like wildfire. Undeterred, Kareem and Lee continued to fight. They spent long nights strategizing, reaching out to new investors who shared their values, working to build alliances with companies that prioritized ethics and sustainability. It was a grueling process, but with every small victory, their resolve grew stronger. But their challenges weren't limited to the business world. One evening, as they returned from a late meeting, they found a message scrawled across the wall of their home in red paint. Leave Istanbul. The threat was chillingly clear. Someone was willing to go beyond words to stop them. Kareem's fists clenched, his eyes dark with anger as he stared at the graffiti. Lee placed a hand on his arm, grounding him, her own heart pounding with fear, but also with resolve. They're trying to scare us, she said softly, but we won't let them. Kareem nodded, his jaw set with determination. No, we won't. They can try all they want, but I'm not backing down. This city, this life, they belong to us now. In the days that followed, Kareem hired security for their home and kept a close eye on his movements. But the threats only strengthened his resolve. He was determined to prove to his father, to the city, and to himself that he could build a future defined by integrity rather than intimidation. One night, as they sat together in their living room, Kareem turned to Lee, his gaze intense. Lee, I know we were brought together by circumstance, and that neither of us asked for this life, he began. But through all of this, you've been by my side. I can't imagine doing this without you. Lee felt a surge of emotion, her chest tightening as she met his gaze. Kareem, I may not have chosen this at first, but I'm choosing it now. I believe in you, in us. They held each other's gaze, a silent promise passing between them. They were not just partners in a business battle or allies in a fight against a legacy. They were bound by something deeper, something that transcended the chaos around them. In the face of the storm gathering around them, they found a sense of peace in each other, a hope that carried them through the darkest nights. And as the city lights sparkled through their window, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They were ready to fight for their future, even if it meant going to war with everything that had once defined their lives.